Okay, we closed out the week. Told you I was expecting a rally this week after hitting support the previous week, and my target is 65.50 on the S&P 500. I expected a right shoulder to form. That's happening, and we got the rally I warned you about 1 week ago. Told you this was going to happen last Thursday and Friday. Seen this rally back up this week on lighter volume. That's not good. Again, the institutions are taking their extended vacations, the bigs, as I call them, the big institutional guns. They're off taking their extended vacations while the retail investors and the retail traders are pushing it back up. And the institutions are going to come back, eventually begin to sell into the rally as they have been doing. The Dow was up. The Dow was up 289 points on the abbreviated session on Black Friday, up 0.61%. The S&P was up 36.5 points, up just over 0.5% higher. NASDAQ up 0.65%. The Russell was up 0.58%. The VIX was down 5% to close at 16.35. Now, next week, we kick off December. We just closed out the monthly chart. Back, it will be December 1st for trading on a Monday. And a brand new month. We'll have on December 1st, Monday, we'll have Fed Chair Powell speaking after the market closes 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be watching that moves futures and possibly markets on Tuesday, December 2nd. Remember, Powell's trying to cancel the December cut coming up here. Powell tried to tell us at the last Fed meeting that the Fed has now stabilized the labor market by doing 2 cuts, and that a December cut isn't necessarily a foregone conclusion. Markets tend to believe this, and then we saw that this week, again, the odds of a rate cut in December turned back up after crashing down with the Fed Fund futures, the betting markets. We'll see if Powell throws cold water on that idea. Powell triggered the sell-off, maintaining or continue to maintain that hawkish tone that he took back at the FOMC press conference there in October. I still think you're going to get a quarter-point cut, but if the Fed does not, they are complete fools because we're about to move into recession. They should be slashing rates already. You know, if you're one of the elites or, one of the so-called experts on the financial channels, you like to say things like, oh, yes, we're going to have a soft landing, which, again, is a made-up fairy tale. It doesn't exist. Every time they claimed that we had a soft landing, we were still in an economic expansion, and they were still in a larger rate-raising campaign. They like to think that they can micromanage the economy, and it makes them feel good about themselves. In reality, their policies always lead to negative outcomes. Always. But we'll get the ADP private payrolls next week on Wednesday. Powell there on Monday night. We'll get personal spending, personal income, consumer sentiment for December, and PCE, the PCE inflation data, which is the Fed's favorite gauge of inflation. So I'll be watching to see if we start seeing the sell-off resuming once the bigs come back from their extended vacation after letting the retail traders and investors run it back up. Please support the channel with the link directly below that allows me to be able to provide you this information. If you follow the link below, it'll take you to a secured site and you can donate any amount you want or make it a recurring donation. If you could take a moment to do that, I would really appreciate it. I don't have any sponsors, just a direct relationship with you. Please consider supporting the channel today. Now, I predicted that we'd have a rally this week, that we would bounce off the support, that the bearish engulfing candlesticks last Thursday would not play out, just as I predicted that sell-off from the October 29th peak down to 65.50. That played out. I was looking for a bottom. Last week we got it. I was looking for a bounce this week. We got it. In this video, I'm going to be talking about that the head and shoulder patterns are forming the right shoulders. I'm going to be talking about, okay, what happens if that plays out? What happens if it doesn't play out? And I'm wrong about the head and shoulder patterns. I always tell you what could happen, tell you what I think, but I also tell you what could happen. And we're going sideways. Remember, the signals have turned back to bullish with the bullish reversal of conditions for momentum and some of the trending signals. The risk is S&P and NASDAQ try to diverge. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's always possible because signals have reverted back to bullish because we're going sideways right now. We have a bullish falling wedge forming on the VIX, which is what we had the last time. And when we had that, again, you got a nearly 9% sell-off on the NASDAQ. You got a nearly 6% sell-off on the S&P. Continue to see something very similar to what we had over here. Now, the MACD's rolled over, but we're still in positive territory. And as we're pulling back, again, the VIX is moving closer and closer to that 200-period moving average. If we see the bullish falling wedge break out, and you get back above the 58th, and volatility should return on the S&P 500 as we've advanced on very, very light volume, get the right shoulders. I told you last week, again, the institutions, earlier this week, I told you as well, the institutions are taking extended vacations, the big money, and they're letting the retail investors and traders run it back up, probably going to come back and sell into the rally, as they've done before. So be aware that this pattern is setting up. Be aware that the 50 and the 200, the spread between them has narrowed, and we could see a bullish cross like we had over here. If we firm up at the center line there on the MACD again, we could see the next wave of selling as the stochastics now become oversold again, which was present at the top when we had the sell-off of nearly 6% on the S&P and nearly 9% on the NASDAQ. Be aware of the bullish falling wedge on the VIX. S&P's had a winning streak on extremely light volume, a 5-day winning streak. The VIX has had a 5-day losing streak, which moves in the opposite direction of the market. I still think we're going to see these head and shoulder patterns play out, but in this video, I will be talking about what happens if they don't. Still turned off major resistance, so watch the video all the way through. And by the way, we have real solid evidence that Bitcoin has topped, Bitcoin has confirmed a bear market in the weekly and the monthly time frame. It's already collapsed by 36%. Stock market's going to follow Bitcoin as it did in 2021 and 2022. So if you believe the bull market is just going to continue and there's absolutely nothing to worry about, you better take heed to the warning signs that Bitcoin's giving, just as it did back in 2021. And the market followed and did exactly what Bitcoin did. Talking a lot about both of them. What happened back in 2021 and 2022? That's what I'm going to be focusing on. What happened the last time Bitcoin confirmed a bear market? What happened to the stock market? I'll be showing you exactly what happened. Last time Bitcoin peaked on November 10th, 2021. What did the NASDAQ and S&P 500 do? But there's very compelling evidence that Bitcoin is now in a bear market. There's confirmation galore in the weekly and monthly time frame that suggests that the S&P and NASDAQ are about to follow suit. Now, the stock market's doing what Bitcoin already did. I've touched on this, but again, you might want to go watch my latest Bitcoin video, even if you don't like Bitcoin, because people predicting Bitcoin's going to go make new highs right now. And I addressed this in my Friday video of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's not going to go make new highs, and why it's going to go make new lows. I will show you proof of that. And if Bitcoin has already begun the bear market, which it has, it's already dropped 36%. It's already confirmed a bear market in the weekly and monthly time frame. Guess what's going to follow? The stock market's going to follow Bitcoin because they have a positive correlation. Currently, Bitcoin's in crash wave 3. That's coming for the stock market. I'll show you evidence of why Bitcoin is not going to go make new highs and why it's going to go make new lows. Pretty fascinating study that I'll be showing you. Now, again, Bitcoin had the head and shoulders pattern. We're right here in the stock market. We're forming the right shoulder. Bitcoin, when that happened, we saw the drop, confirming the pattern, and then back tested to the 20-day moving average, and then we saw this dramatic drop on Bitcoin. You're going to see the same thing in the stock market. I think Bitcoin's going to take out the April low. I think the stock market's moving back towards the April lows. They bottomed together in April. Bitcoin's leading the charge lower. The stock market is still forming the head and shoulders pattern. But we're seeing evidence that Bitcoin has now confirmed a bear market. Usually the asset with the most volatility usually peaks first, which is Bitcoin, and the stock market follows. That's the way it happened in 2021 before the 2022 sell-off. I think Bitcoin's going to new lows. I think this 80,000 area will be taken out and the divergence will eventually form, or maybe a multiple point divergence. I think the stock market plays catch up as Bitcoin drops down on 74,000, probably a 50% drop as it's done in the past to kick off other bear markets. Now we're seeing the S&P and NASDAQ doing what Bitcoin already did, and that is forming right shoulders. We had a 5-day winning streak with our short trading week this week. We had that update on Friday, the previous week there. Every day this week was up. I told you to expect a bounce off of this neckline right here, and I told you 65.50, which was a low over here, my first target from the top over here at major resistance in the weekly time frame to hit that level. I was looking for this head and shoulders because that's what happened with Bitcoin. We're seeing this rally, but it's on very, very light volume. And we'll be watching when the institutions come back. Do they come back and they start selling again? Start selling. And the rally up here, they sold. That's what we saw with Bitcoin. The rallies were being sold. So do we get another lower high here? Do we fill this gap, 68.52, or just below it at 68.50 at our high for the Friday session? Got another gap at 68.92. I don't know that we fill that gap, but again, I'll be watching to see if the sellers come back. We've got the 10 below the 50. The 20 is still not below it. They're trying to curl back up with this rally on very light volume. Problem, you've got price advancing on declining volume. This is SPY in the weekly time frame. This is the weekly chart of SPY. We've seen other rallies on lighter volume. It's ended up marking over here, the December top. Eventually, we rallied to a new high, and we saw more declining volume, and that ended up marking the February top. A rally going into our October top was lighter volume, and then followed by an increase in distribution volume. That's the problem. We're advancing on lighter volume because everybody's gone for an extended holiday surrounding Thanksgiving. Now we see the same thing with QQQ, again advancing on declining volume. These are bigger days right here. This is there's bigger week here. Both QQQ and SPY. This is options expiration, and you usually see that surrounding options expiration. But same thing here. We're advancing on declining volume. Do the institutions come back and start selling again? S&P 500 has come up to just above the 78.6 Fibonacci. Again, we're right below this gap. Just by about 2 points or so, just under 2 points. And at 68.92, we got the one above it. So I'll be watching these gaps as we go into next week. Now, remember, we also have these gaps higher. We got another one here on the Friday session. We had one the day before Thanksgiving. We had one way back here, back on Monday. So I'll be watching these gaps as well. Remember all these gaps over here? And we came back and we filled them all and moved beyond the October 10th low. So we'll be watching these gaps. Now, NASDAQ 100 has had a bigger sell-off. Again, moving down close to 9% lower. The S&P dropped just under 6%. We're above the 61.8 Fibonacci. Currently, the NASDAQ is in the golden pocket. The S&P is just above the 78.6 Fibonacci. We have the gap way up here. I don't know that we reached that level. We've had the gap from Monday and the gap higher the day before Thanksgiving and our gap higher on Black Friday. We're coming up towards this gap fill up here, and we're just below that level, deeper into the golden pocket between the 61.8 Fibonacci and the 78.6 Fibonacci. So again, we'll be watching. Do we end up setting up a right shoulder? We're advancing on lighter volume. Institutions push it a little bit higher and then come back and sell, or they come back and start selling immediately. And what about these gaps overhead up here? Do we reach it? What about this gap up here? And again, we don't have to fill these gaps. P is right below its gap at 68.52. NASDAQ's a little bit further away from it, but again, we very well could fill these gaps, but we don't have to. But again, I'll be watching. If the S&P fills that gap, does NASDAQ fill it and then start to turn? What about this gap up here? Just some things I'm paying attention to and wanted to show you the Fibonacci retracement levels. We're further away from the highs than the S&P 500. I told you back on October 29th that I thought we had a top for the NASDAQ and a top for the S&P 500. We're slamming into major resistance. Told you we are going back to these October 10th lows and probably would form a right shoulder. That's happening. I still think we've topped. I still think we're setting up these head and shoulders. But I always tell you, even though I tell you what I think, I always tell you, hey, if I'm wrong, here's what to be watching for. Here's what could happen. I'm not predicting this is going to happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm telling you that it could happen. And that is that we do what we did in 2021. That is, we had Bitcoin peak first on November 10th, 2021. A couple weeks later, NASDAQ peaked and S&P put in a peak. And to see the sell-off. Let me just bring it up. Here is the NASDAQ 100 daily chart back in 2021. Bitcoin peaked November 10th. That's this bar on the NASDAQ 100. NASDAQ peaked November 22nd. Began to get all the volatility. This is November of 2021. We got volatility in November. We got volatility in December. We had these rallies back up, but they failed. They failed to move to a new high. We also had the rallies back up on the S&P, but it did move slightly above that high, and it diverged with NASDAQ. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it could. If the NASDAQ goes up and tries to fill its gap and it can't make a new high, get a bigger rally with NASDAQ. And again, predicting that that's going to happen. I think both have peaked, but I'm telling you, if I'm wrong about that, I could be right that NASDAQ peaked and S&P did not. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know that that happens, but I think it's important to explain different possibilities how the top could form. If I'm right about the head and shoulder patterns, we go down. If I'm wrong about the head and shoulder pattern on the S&P, we go higher, get a double top, and NASDAQ makes a lower high. NASDAQ is a bigger sell-off, and it's not rebounding. It's not rebounding much as we've seen with the S&P 500 as far as Fibonacci retracements. We'll see how it plays out, but I just wanted to remind you that S&P did peak after Bitcoin peaking first, then the NASDAQ, and then the S&P. I told you I didn't think it would play out that way this time because I think the S&P is pretty much NASDAQ Junior. And if we start seeing more selling with the institutions when they come back, then again, the October 29th highs are going to hold. Look at right here. We had this big rally back up here surrounding the holidays and Christmas, but look at what happened and followed. Had the rally up surrounding going into Thanksgiving and then a counter trend, but look at what followed surrounding the holidays. So do we see something similar to that here? When the S&P peaked in January of 2022, NASDAQ had set up a lower high. It had already peaked back in November. Bitcoin had already peaked. Do we see something like that again? My guess is that's not going to be the case, but I always tell you what could happen. I don't just share with you my personal opinion. I share with you different possibilities of the way things can play out, even if I may not agree with them. Bitcoin's already confirmed a bear market. Bitcoin's already had the head and shoulders. If the odds greatly favor, you're going to see that with the NASDAQ and S&P. Get this holiday distribution Going into the Fed meeting in December, we see the sell-off surrounding the Fed meeting as well. Or if the S&P does try to move higher and diverge with NASDAQ, you can see distribution with the Fed meeting. That's what happened in 2007. We got sell-offs both in October and December, the December meetings. I think the market is going to play catch up to Bitcoin. There's a lot of convincing evidence that the top is in for Bitcoin and it's started a bear market. There's a lot of signals confirming that in the weekly and the monthly time frame. Now, here's what happened in 2022. The NASDAQ made that lower high. Bitcoin had already peaked. A couple weeks later, NASDAQ peaked. S&P sold off with the NASDAQ on November 22nd. We saw the sell-off. We saw the rebound back up. More selling, again, just like the NASDAQ. But then, surrounding Christmas, going into the holidays, we saw a rally back up with Christmas on into the new year. And we went higher by about 1.5% above that high. And then after that, again, merging with NASDAQ, the bottom began to drop out of the S&P very quickly. We dropped 12.5% to this low, and then we ended up rallying back up when we dropped more. We ended up dropping nearly 15% in less than 2 months. I don't know that we moved to new highs on the S&P. Personally, I think we're going to set up the head and shoulder patterns. If I'm wrong about the head and shoulder patterns, the S&P 500, NASDAQ will make a lower high, S&P could still make a higher high, and again, moving just slightly above that high on lighter holiday volume, which is what we've just seen happen. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it could if when the institutions come back, rather than starting to immediately sell, they push it up to a new high to create a fake out like they did recently with the Dow. Again, this is the daily time frame. They push it up to a new high. Here it was for 7 days. They pushed up here to a new high, went sideways, started to pull back, and then went a little bit higher. We're at new highs for 7 days, and then you reversed, and you dropped right back down below the peak over here in November. So again, not saying we're going to move to new highs, but we could. The signals have turned back to bullish because we're going sideways in the market, and that's why we're getting the potential head and shoulder patterns. Now here it ended up being a double top pattern, and again, the double tops, you often will move slightly above this level. In this case, it was about 1.5% higher. Trigger all the stops, and then you get the major distribution. And look how quickly we fell from January down to January 6th down to January 24th. You dropped 12.5% in 12 sessions, or about 2.5 weeks. And then you rally back up, and by the time, in less than 2 months, got an even bigger decline. I don't know if this scenario plays out, but I wanted to share that with you. The S&P moved above at 78.6 Fibonacci. It's doing it on lighter volume. Wrong about the head and shoulders on the S&P. May go higher. I could be right about the NASDAQ top and end up being wrong about the S&P top if they end up forming a larger divergence as they did. And I only say that because, again, I'm seeing real evidence that Bitcoin has topped and started a bear market. When Bitcoin is closed below the 50-week moving average and confirmed a bear market, it's never moved to new highs without ushering in the bear market. It's never happened before. You can watch my Bitcoin video at the end of this one. I think the stock market's going to play catch up, but in 2021, you had the stock of Bitcoin peak. A couple weeks later, NASDAQ and S&P got a peak. S&P eventually went and made a slightly higher high, 1.5% higher, just over 1.5% higher, and then it peaked, and again, we had the 2022 sell-off. Do we see that again, or did NASDAQ and S&P peak together? Major resistance. And again, if we do move to a new high, there's major resistance directly overhead on the S&P. If you look at the weekly chart, we bounced in April off of this trend line from the 2020 low, excluded the shadow there at the April 2025 low here on the weekly chart, and we went up to the upper channel line, parallel boundary from the 2022 high. This is the peak that we were just talking about, how we went slightly higher. And look what happened over here. You hit the trend line, you came back down, and you hit it again, and then this followed. So do we see that again, or do we get that head and shoulders pattern setting up like Bitcoin did? We went right back and slammed into the trend line. So if I'm wrong about the head and shoulders, you're going to hit that trend line again if S&P can make a new high. I'm not predicting the S&P is going to make a new high. I'm not saying it will. I'm telling you, if I'm wrong about the head and shoulders, that trend line comes into play again. That's what I'm telling you. Remember, I told you the S&P had slightly overthrown that trend line in the weekly time frame. We close above it. We ended up getting a topping tail. We got confirmation of that, and then we got a follow through over here. But we've rallied back up on lighter volume, seeing signals turn back to bullish. So the risk is that doesn't play out, and we attempt to challenge the high over here. And if you do challenge the high over here, the trend line is right above it. From our high this week right here, our closing high, the trend line is 1.65% above where we are right now, which is the same amount or near the same amount, that 1.5% amount that we moved when we moved to a new high back in 2022. That's how much you moved up, about 1.5%, just over 1.5% higher than the previous peak. This would be less than that if we moved above this high over here and stalled at the trend line. Again, let me repeat, I'm not saying or predicting that happens, but I'm telling you, if we do not get my head and shoulder pattern setting up, turn off the gap at 68.52 there that we're directly below, try to go to the next gap or challenge this high, then you would do what you did in 2022 and you would have a double top pattern. Likely diverge with the NASDAQ. If we follow what Bitcoin did, we can get the head and shoulders pattern. If the institutions come back up and they try to push it back up or let the retail investors continue to run it back up so they can sell more, then again, you could go about another 1.5%, just over 1.5% higher, back up to the trend line, just as we did in 2022. And if you do, you'd form a double top. Right before we had the sell-off from the February high down to the April low of 21%, you formed there a double top. Here again in the weekly time frame, you went slightly higher than this high, and you formed a double top, and the 21% sell-off followed. What's even more interesting about the 2021-2022 top here for the S&P 500 is it went higher, it formed a little miniature double top, but I've been talking about that larger head and shoulders pattern setting up, and we had the same thing present here back in 2022, and you came down and you did what Bitcoin did. You formed a lopsided head and shoulders pattern, just like Bitcoin did early 2022. The S&P did the exact same thing, and that's why I'm saying we can get a big sell-off here in the weekly time frame back to these lows, these previous lows, and end up taking them out. We did it rather quickly. We are further away from the April lows than we were at the peak here to these lows. Just food for thought. And right now is setting up a head and shoulders, just like the potential head and shoulders on the S&P 500. I don't know that we move to new highs. Personally, again, I think the head and shoulder patterns will have a very, very good chance of playing out, but the S&P is closer to the previous high than NASDAQ, and knowing the history that Bitcoin peaks, NASDAQ peaked after that, and then the S&P put in a peak but ended up diverging, moving around 1.5% higher by January of 2022, where we had the 2022 sell-off for all of them, opens the door to that possibility. I want to bury my head in the sand and ignore the possibilities. We have turned off major resistance, going sideways right now. Signals have reverted back to bullish. Is that possibility? That's why I'm taking the time to share these charts with you and to review this with you. While it may not play out, there is the possibility that that does happen, and we see the stop triggered, moving slightly above the previous peak, and then quickly getting reversal and a sell-off. The S&P 500 weekly chart, and again, we're closer than NASDAQ to the previous high, but we're still not there. We got a massive bar here, but it was on lighter volume, so you have to take that into consideration. So as I said, I'll be watching these gaps. I'll be watching the gaps directly overhead. We're 2 points below this one, and I'll be watching the one at 68.92. I'll be watching gaps below, and do we end up seeing the 5-day losing streak quickly fail, turning down sharply, like the gaps over here? And we quickly reversed after sharp gaps higher, pushing up here above this area. Do we see something similar to that? And the institutions come back and start selling. I'm still of the belief we're going to get a lower high and that the head and shoulder patterns are still going to play out. I wanted to show you the scenario that if they don't, if we start getting some selling pressure in the institutions, they push it higher, let the retail investors push it higher and do the big rug pull. However it may unfold, bring that to your attention. I still think that the head and shoulders pattern is likely the path that the market is on, but I wanted to show you, if I'm wrong, where the trend line is directly above this, directly over that level. And like I said, about over 1.5% from where we closed on Friday. To make you aware of that, I still think the head and shoulder patterns are going to play out. I always tell you what could happen if I'm wrong when I tell you what I think. Just like at the April bottom, when I told you the day of the bottom that I believe that was the bottom at key support. Told you I thought we had a 3-leg correction down, but I told you if I'm wrong, we'll see a 5-leg correction and we'll take out the levels of support that I've talked about. Now, was I right about that bottom? Yes. I always try to tell you, hey, if I'm not, here's what could happen. But I was right about that April low. We'll see what becomes of this. We've had a 5-day winning streak on extremely light volume. P500 is forming a divergence on the RSI and on the histogram for the MACD right here as we're coming up to try to fill this gap right here, and we're just a fraction below it. Again, just under 2 points below that level with our high at 68.50 and almost 68.51. So I mean, it's less than 2 points that we're there, and hit 68.50.86. So again, right below it. I'll be watching what becomes of this divergence. We had one over here at the top that led to the sell-off. Bullish divergence gave us the rebound back up. The bearish divergence gave us a sell-off for the left shoulder. I'll be watching. We see that complete here near these gaps, or do we try to challenge the highs? Similar situation like we did back in 2022. I think this pattern has a good shot at playing out. I told you over here that I thought we topped. Headed back to 65.50, which was the low over here. That was correct, but we've got this potential slanted downward sloping neckline. Now we may fill the gap at 68.92 up here, but we don't have to. No requirement that we do. So I'll be watching to see what happens. Stochastics become very overbought, and we've had this 5-day winning streak. The 50 is still below the 200. What happened with Bitcoin. Bitcoin rallied back up above the 200, but eventually ended up dropping back below them, and that was the right shoulder in the 4-hour time frame for Bitcoin. Do we see something similar here? We got the sell-off I was looking for down to 65.50. We got the bottom I told you I was looking for last week, looking for a right shoulder to develop the Thanksgiving week holiday. We got that. Now I get the sell-off I'm looking for and complete the right shoulder. I'll be watching. I have the same thing going on here with NASDAQ. We're above the 200 period, 50 still below it. There is no diversion, so on the RSI here, there doesn't have to be. But again, after a nearly 9% sell-off, S&P is closer to the previous highs than the NASDAQ. NASDAQ 60-minute chart here. The same thing here for the NASDAQ. After dropping nearly 9% from hitting resistance in the weekly time frame, we're bouncing off these 100 period moving averages, lower Bollinger Bands, and we've rallied back up to 10 here, below the 50, just like S&P. We've gotten above the 20 period, and again, coming back, we're just under the gap over here, as I mentioned, and again, you've got the big one back up here. I'll be watching the gaps as we go into next week. I'll be watching, do we end up completing this right shoulder and selling off, dropping back below the moving averages and resuming the decline? Again, we continue to see the selling into the rallies. We continue to see the selling. Do we see it here as the institutions come back, or do they push it a little higher and we see the selling form these head and shoulders We go up and try to fill this gap on NASDAQ and end up seeing S&P and NASDAQ diverge from one another, as we saw at the 2022 peak for the S&P. It got a new high and NASDAQ got a lower high. So just some things to be aware of, to be paying attention to. Bitcoin is likely completing its counter trend. If it starts selling off, do we see the market back down? Bitcoin's been rebounding back up in a counter trend as well. Just be aware of the advance on lighter volume and all these gaps that have now formed. So if we start to sell off, you might get that 20 pushing back down below the 50 period moving average.